The summer I turned 14, I thought I knew everything about the dry hills surrounding our village of Pentelopos, but I was wrong about almost everything. I thought the strange bones we sometimes found in the red clay were just old animal remains,
Ouranopithecus.
probably from goats
Ouranopithecus
or
shares
sheep that
traits with
had died
hominins,
during one
but
of the
is it our
harsh winters.
ancestor?
I
Traditional
thought the
models of
layers of
human
different
origins.
colored earth in the hillside cuts were just how dirt naturally arranged itself. And I definitely thought that French people were probably too soft and city-bred to handle the blazing heat and rough terrain of northern Greece in July. That was before Professor Louis de Bonis arrived with his team from the University of Poitiers, carrying more equipment than our entire village owned and speaking Greek with an accent so thick you had to concentrate just to understand what he was trying to say. Before I learned that those old bones I'd been stepping over my whole life might hold secrets about where human beings came from. Before I discovered that science could be more exciting than any adventure story, and that sometimes the most important discoveries happen right under your feet. It was 1975, and Greece was still finding its footing after the fall of the military junta the year before. Our village hadn't seen much change from all the political upheaval in Athens. We were too small and remote for any of that to matter much to our daily lives. We still lived the way our grandfathers had lived, tending olive groves and vegetable gardens, raising chickens and goats, following the rhythms of the seasons that had governed life in these hills for thousands of years. My father, Kostas Papadakis, worked a small plot of land that had belonged to our family for generations, growing olives and almonds and whatever vegetables would survive in our rocky soil. My mother, Maria, helped tend our animals and made the best tyropita in 3 villages, though she'd never admit to being proud of it. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough: fresh bread every morning, olive oil that tasted like sunshine, and a stone house with thick walls that kept us cool even during the worst heat of summer. The morning everything changed started with my mother shaking me awake before dawn. "Nikos," she whispered, "get up quietly. Don't wake your sister. Your father needs help moving the goats to the upper pasture before the heat gets too bad." I groaned and pulled my thin cotton sheet over my head, but she yanked it away with the efficiency of someone who had been dealing with reluctant teenage sons for generations of mothers before her. The air coming through my small window was already warm, promising another scorching day where the sun would turn the hills the color of old brass and make the cicadas shriek loud enough to hurt your ears. I pulled on my worn canvas pants and the faded blue shirt that had once belonged to my older brother before he moved to Thessaloniki to work in a factory. My leather sandals, resoled twice by the village shoemaker, slapped against my feet as I made my way downstairs to where my father was already loading supplies for the day. "Good morning, my son," he said, handing me a canvas bag filled with bread and cheese and a ceramic jug of water that would be lukewarm within an hour. "Today we take the goats to the ridge pasture. The grass is better there, and they'll have shade from the pine trees." I nodded, still half asleep but familiar enough with this routine that I could do it without thinking. We'd been making this trip every few weeks since I was old enough to help control the animals, following ancient paths that wound through olive groves and up steep hillsides scattered with the white bones of limestone that jutted from the red earth like broken teeth. Our goats knew the routine as well as we did. As soon as my father opened their pen, they began moving up the familiar trail, their bells creating a music that had been part of the landscape since anyone could remember. I walked behind them with a long stick, occasionally redirecting one that decided to investigate something interesting along the path, while my father led the way with the confidence of someone who had walked these hills his entire life. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern mountains gold when we passed the place where the road construction crew had been working the previous month. The Greek government was finally building a proper road to connect our village with the main highway to Thessaloniki, which meant cutting through several hillsides and creating some dramatic exposures of the Earth's layers. It was at one of these cuts that I noticed something unusual. Where the road crew had sliced through the hill, you could see distinct layers of different colored sediment, red clay, yellow sand, bands of white limestone. But in one section, the red clay layer seemed to contain something that didn't belong there. Dark objects that weren't rocks, scattered through the soil like raisins in bread. "Papa," I called, pointing toward the hillside cut. "Look at that layer of red clay. What are all those dark things?" My father followed my gaze and shrugged. "Probably old bones from animals that died long ago. The earth is full of such things. Come on, we need to get the goats settled before the heat becomes unbearable." But I couldn't stop thinking about those dark objects embedded in the clay. Something about them bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on what. They seemed too numerous, too systematically distributed to be random animal deaths. And some of them looked larger than what you'd expect from the sheep and goats that populated our hills. We spent the morning getting the goats settled in their new pasture, checking the spring that provided their water, and making sure the stone walls that kept them contained were in good repair. By the time we started home, the sun was directly overhead and the heat was like a weight pressing down on everything. Even the goats had given up moving and were clustered in whatever shade they could find. It was during our walk home that we encountered the strangers. We first heard their voices as we approached the road cut, people speaking in a language that wasn't Greek, discussing something with obvious excitement. When we crested the ridge and could see down into the area where the road crew had been working, I counted 5 people gathered around the very section of exposed hillside that had caught my attention that morning. 3 of them were clearly foreigners, a tall man with graying hair and a sun hat, a younger man with a beard and round spectacles, and a woman wearing practical khaki clothes and carrying what looked like scientific equipment. The other 2 were Greeks, but not from our village. I recognized them as Yannis and Petros, graduate students from the University of Thessaloniki who sometimes came to our area looking for interesting rocks and fossils. My father approached them with the careful politeness that Greek villagers always showed to educated strangers. "Good afternoon," he called out in Greek. "I hope you are finding what you are looking for." The tall foreign man looked up from where he had been examining something in the exposed clay layer. When he spoke, his Greek was heavily accented but understandable. "Good afternoon. I am Professor Louis de Bonis from the University of Poitiers in France. We are studying the geological formations in this area." He gestured toward the hillside cut. "This exposure is quite remarkable. The sediment layers here preserve a record of ancient environments dating back millions of years." I found myself staring at the equipment spread around their work area. They had brushes of various sizes, small tools that looked like dental picks, measuring devices, cameras, and notebooks covered with detailed drawings and measurements. Everything was organized with a precision that spoke of serious scientific work. "What exactly are you studying?" my father asked. Professor de Bonis's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone passionate about his work. "We are paleontologists. We study ancient life through fossils. These sediment layers contain the remains of plants and animals that lived here long, long ago, when this landscape was very different from what you see today." The woman, who had been photographing something in the clay layer, looked up and spoke in accented English to Professor de Bonis. He responded in rapid French, then turned back to us. "My colleague Dr. Milentis has just found something very interesting," he said. "Would you like to see?" My father nodded, and I followed eagerly as Professor de Bonis led us to where Dr. Milentis was working. She had been carefully brushing clay away from what looked like a curved piece of bone, dark brown with age and partially embedded in the red sediment. "This appears to be part of a skull," Professor Debonis explained. From the size and shape, we believe it belonged to an ancient primate, a relative of apes and monkeys that lived here approximately 9 or 10 million years ago. I stared at the fossil with fascination. The idea that apes had once lived in these hills seemed impossible. The only primates I knew about were the ones you saw in picture books, exotic creatures that lived in tropical jungles, not in the dry Mediterranean landscape of northern Greece. But sir, I said, surprising myself by speaking up, how could apes live here? This isn't jungle. Professor Debonis smiled at my question. An excellent observation, young man. You're absolutely right that this isn't suitable habitat for modern apes. But 9 or 10 million years ago, the climate here was very different. These hills were covered with dense forests, and the weather was much more tropical than it is today. The bearded man, who had been taking notes in a leather-bound journal, looked up from his work. The fossil record tells us that Europe once had a very diverse primate fauna, he said in careful Greek. We've found evidence of ancient apes in Germany, France, Spain, and now here in Greece. As they continued to work that afternoon, carefully exposing more of the skull fossil and documenting everything they found, I became increasingly fascinated by their methods. Every fragment of bone was photographed in place before being removed. Measurements were taken of everything. The exact position of each find was recorded on detailed maps. Why is it so important to write down where everything is found? I asked during a break when Professor Debonis was showing me some of the tools they used. Because the context is as important as the fossil itself, he explained. Knowing exactly which layer of sediment contained each bone tells us how old it is. Knowing what other fossils were found nearby tells us about the environment the animal lived in. A fossil without context is just an interesting piece of bone. A fossil with proper documentation is a window into the past. By late afternoon, they had exposed enough of the skull to see that it was remarkably complete. The top of the cranium, parts of the face, even some teeth were preserved in the clay that had protected them for millions of years. This is truly exceptional, Professor Debonis said as he photographed the exposed fossil from multiple angles. Complete primate skulls from this time period are extremely rare. This specimen could tell us a great deal about human evolution. The word human caught my attention immediately. You mean this could be related to people? I asked. Possibly, he said carefully. We won't know for certain until we can study it properly in the laboratory. But fossils like this help us understand the evolutionary relationships between modern humans and our ancient relatives. As the sun began to sink toward the western hills, the paleontologists carefully covered their work area with canvas tarps to protect it from wind and rain. Professor Debonis approached my father with a proposition. Mr. Papadakis, he said, we would very much like to return tomorrow to continue our work here. Would it be possible for us to hire your son as a local assistant? He seems very interested in what we're doing, and it would be helpful to have someone familiar with the local area. My father looked at me, then back at the professor. What exactly would he be doing? Helping us navigate the terrain, assisting with equipment, perhaps learning some basic paleontological techniques. We would pay him, of course, and ensure his safety at all times. I held my breath, afraid my father would say no. The idea of working with real scientists, of being part of discovering fossils that were millions of years old, was more exciting than anything I had ever imagined. My father considered this for a long moment. Very well, he said finally. But only if his work here doesn't interfere with his responsibilities at home, and only if you promise to teach him something useful. Professor Debonis reached out to shake my father's hand. You have my word. Your son will receive an education in paleontology that no school could provide. That evening at dinner, I could barely contain my excitement as I told my mother and younger sister about the day's discoveries. My sister, Eleni, listened with the polite attention of someone who thought rocks and old bones were probably the most boring things in the world, but my mother asked thoughtful questions about the scientists and their work. Just remember, she warned, serving me a second helping of stewed lamb with wild greens, these people are educated foreigners doing important work. You must be respectful and helpful, not get in their way or ask too many questions. I promised to be on my best behavior, though I was so excited I could barely sleep that night. I lay in bed thinking about the ancient skull embedded in the red clay, about apes that had lived in tropical forests where now there were only olive trees and rocky pastures, about the possibility that these fossils might somehow be connected to the story of human evolution. The next morning, I was up before dawn, dressed and ready to go before my parents had even begun stirring. I helped my father with the morning chores in record time, barely containing my impatience to get back to the excavation site. When we arrived at the road cut, I found the paleontological team already at work. They had brought additional equipment, screens for sifting sediment, more sophisticated measuring tools, and what looked like a portable laboratory set up under a canvas awning. Professor Debonis greeted me warmly and immediately began explaining what they would be doing that day. Today, Nikos, we begin the careful process of removing the skull from the matrix of sediment that has preserved it. This requires patience and precision. One careless move could destroy millions of years of scientific information. He handed me a small brush and showed me how to gently remove sediment from around the fossil. The work was painstakingly slow, requiring constant attention and a delicate touch, but I found it completely absorbing. Each brush stroke revealed more details of the ancient skull, the curve of the eye socket, the ridge where powerful jaw muscles had once attached, the hollow spaces where a brain had once thought thoughts we could never imagine. As we worked, Professor Debonis explained what we were seeing. Notice how the forehead is relatively low compared to a modern human skull, he said, pointing to the fossil with a small tool. And see how the face projects forward? These are primitive characteristics that we associate with early primates. Dr. Milentis, working nearby on other fossils from the same layer, called out something in French that made Professor Debonis hurry over to see what she had found. When he returned, his expression was one of barely contained excitement. She's found jaw fragments with teeth, he told me. The teeth are particularly important because they tell us about diet and evolutionary relationships. Would you like to help expose them? I nodded eagerly, and he guided my hands as I carefully brushed sediment away from what turned out to be a remarkably well-preserved section of upper jaw with several teeth still in place. The teeth were larger than human teeth but smaller than those of modern apes, with a pattern of cusps and ridges that Professor Debonis examined with obvious fascination. These dental characteristics are very interesting, he murmured, making detailed notes in his field journal. They show a combination of primitive and derived features that could be significant for understanding hominoid evolution. Over the following days, the excavation expanded as more fossils were discovered in the same sediment layer. Parts of limb bones, vertebrae, even fragments of ribs emerged from the ancient clay. Each discovery was documented with the same meticulous care, photographed, measured, and catalogued before being wrapped in protective material. I learned to recognize different types of fossils, to distinguish between bone and stone, to spot the subtle color and texture differences that indicated the presence of preserved remains. Professor Debonis taught me about stratigraphy, how to read the story told by layers of sediment, each one representing a different period in the Earth's history. This red clay layer, he explained one afternoon as we took a break from excavating, was deposited by rivers and streams about 9 million years ago. The climate then was much warmer and wetter than today. These hills were covered with dense forests inhabited by a diverse community of animals, ancient elephants, rhinoceroses, antelopes, carnivores, and primates like our friend here. He gestured toward the skull, which had now been almost completely exposed and was ready for removal from the hillside. This individual lived and died in that ancient forest. When it died, sediments gradually buried the remains, and over millions of years, minerals replaced the original bone material, creating the fossil we're now studying. The process of removing the skull from the hillside took 2 full days. Professor Debonis and his team built a plaster jacket around the fossil to protect it during transport, creating what looked like a white cocoon around the ancient bone. Watching them work, I gained a new appreciation for the patience and skill required for paleontological research. In the laboratory, Professor Debonis explained as they prepared the fossil for transport, we'll use special tools and techniques to remove the remaining sediment and study the skull in detail. We'll make detailed measurements, compare it with other fossils, and try to determine exactly where it fits in the evolutionary tree. As word of the discovery spread, more scientists began arriving at our little excavation site. Paleontologists from Athens and Thessaloniki came to see the fossils. Reporters from Greek newspapers and magazines interviewed Professor Debonis about the significance of the find. Officials from the Ministry of Culture visited to assess the importance of the site. Through it all, I remained Professor Debonis's local assistant and unofficial student. He continued to teach me about paleontology, geology, and evolution, treating my questions with the same seriousness he showed to his professional colleagues. I began to keep my own field notebook, documenting everything I observed and learned. "You have a natural talent for this work, Nikos," he told me one evening as we reviewed the day's discoveries. "You see details that others might miss, and you ask the right questions. Have you ever thought about studying science?" The idea had never occurred to me before that summer. School in our village went only through the basic levels, and I had always assumed I would follow my father into farming. But working with the paleontological team had opened my eyes to possibilities I had never imagined. "I don't know if that would be possible," I admitted. "My family doesn't have money for university, and I'm not sure I'm smart enough for that kind of education." Professor Debonis looked at me seriously. "Intelligence isn't just about grades in school, Nikos. It's about curiosity, observation, and the ability to think critically about what you see. You have all of those qualities. If you're truly interested in pursuing science, there are ways to make it possible." That conversation planted a seed in my mind that would continue growing long after the paleontologists packed up their equipment and returned to their universities. For the first time in my life, I began to imagine a future that extended beyond the hills of northern Greece, a future where I might contribute to the great human project of understanding our past. The most significant discovery came during the 3rd week of excavation. While working in a slightly different section of the exposed hillside, Dr. Milentis uncovered what appeared to be a second skull, this one smaller and more gracile than the first. As they carefully exposed it, the differences between the two fossils became apparent. "We may have found a male and female of the same species," Professor Debonis explained excitedly. "Sexual dimorphism, differences in size and structure between males and females, is common in primates. If these represent a mated pair, it could give us unprecedented insight into the social behavior and physical characteristics of these ancient apes." The second skull was even better preserved than the first, with delicate facial bones intact and a nearly complete set of teeth. As Professor Debonis and his team studied it, Their excitement grew. "The facial structure is remarkably human-like for such an ancient primate," he observed. "The reduced projection of the face, the configuration of the teeth, these are characteristics we associate with the human lineage." Word of the second discovery brought even more attention to our excavation site. Paleontologists from universities across Europe began arriving to examine the fossils. The small dirt road to our village became busy with cars carrying scientists, reporters, and officials. My role as local guide and translator became increasingly important as more people arrived who spoke no Greek. Professor Debonis relied on me to help coordinate with local officials, arrange accommodations for visiting scientists, and facilitate communication with the village elders who were fascinated by all the attention their quiet community was receiving. "These fossils," Professor Debonis explained to a group of visiting scientists one afternoon, "represent a previously unknown species of ancient ape. Based on their age and characteristics, they may be closely related to the ancestors of both modern apes and humans." The name they gave to the new species was Ouranopithecus macedonensis, the ape from Macedonia, honoring both its celestial significance and its geographic origin. The scientific papers describing the discovery would eventually appear in prestigious journals, establishing the fossils as important evidence for understanding primate evolution in Europe. But for me, the most important impact was personal. Professor Debonis had arranged for me to receive a scholarship to continue my education in Thessaloniki, where I could study the sciences that would prepare me for university. It meant leaving my village, leaving my family, entering a world I had only just begun to imagine. The night before I was to leave for the city, my family gathered on our terrace to watch the sunset paint the familiar hills in shades of gold and purple. The excavation site was now covered with protective barriers, and the paleontologists had returned to their laboratories to study the fossils we had helped discover. "You know," my father said, "I've lived in these hills my entire life, and I never imagined they held such secrets. It makes you wonder what else is hidden beneath our feet." My mother reached over and took my hand. "Promise me you'll never forget where you come from, Nikos. No matter how educated you become, no matter how far you travel, remember that your roots are here in this soil." I promised, and I meant it. But as I looked out over the landscape that had shaped my childhood, I also felt the pull of a larger world, a world where the mysteries of our evolutionary past waited to be uncovered and understood. The next morning, Professor Debonis's car arrived to take me to Thessaloniki. As we drove away from Pentelophos, I watched my village disappear behind the hills, but I carried with me more than just memories. I carried the knowledge that science was not something that happened only in distant laboratories and universities, but something that could transform the understanding of a place and the life of a curious boy willing to ask questions about old bones in red clay. Professor Debonis continued to mentor me throughout my educational journey. During summers, I returned to work on continuing excavations at the site, which had become one of the most important paleontological localities in the eastern Mediterranean. Each season brought new discoveries that added to our understanding of European primate evolution and the complex story of human origins. The Ouranopithecus fossils we discovered that first summer proved to be even more significant than Professor Debonis had initially suspected. Detailed laboratory studies revealed that they possessed a unique combination of characteristics, some primitive features inherited from earlier apes, and some derived features that appeared to anticipate later developments in human evolution. What makes Ouranopithecus so important, Professor Debonis explained to me years later when I had become a paleontologist myself, is that it shows us that the human evolutionary story is more complex than we once thought. These fossils demonstrate that human-like characteristics were evolving in different primate lineages across Africa and Europe millions of years ago. The discovery challenged existing theories about human evolution and sparked debates that continue in scientific journals today. Some researchers argue that Ouranopithecus represents an important step toward human origins, while others see it as a side branch that contributed little to our direct ancestry. But regardless of these debates, the fossils from that hillside near my village have permanently enriched our understanding of primate evolution. Years later, when I lead my own paleontological expeditions in other parts of Greece and the Mediterranean, I often think back to that summer when I was 14 and first learned to see the deep past preserved in layers of ancient sediment. Professor de Bonis had been right, paleontology was detective work, but it was more than that. It was a way of connecting with the vast sweep of evolutionary time, of understanding our place in the long story of life on Earth. The excavation site near Pentelophos is now protected as a paleontological preserve, and the village has built a small museum to display casts of the most important fossils. Visitors come from universities around the world to study the collections and to experience the landscape where Ouranopithecus once lived. Sometimes, when I return home to visit my aging parents, I climb up to the old excavation site and sit quietly among the limestone outcrops and wild olive trees. The red clay layers that once held such secrets are now protected behind barriers, but I can still see the precise spots where we made our most important discoveries. In those quiet moments, I think about the individual animals whose fossilized remains we found, Ouranopithecus individuals who lived and died in ancient forests, who had no way of knowing that their bones would someday help scientists understand the deep roots of human evolution. I think about how a curious teenager's willingness to ask questions about dark objects in a hillside cut led to discoveries that changed scientific understanding of our evolutionary past. The truth about Ouranopithecus, as I learned that summer and in the years that followed, is that it represents one piece in the vast puzzle of human origins. It shows us that the path from ancient apes to modern humans was not a simple, straight line, but a complex branching tree with many experiments in human-like characteristics occurring across different times and places. Professor de Bonis taught me that every fossil has a story to tell, but the most important stories emerge when we consider fossils not as isolated specimens but as parts of ancient ecosystems and evolutionary processes. Ouranopithecus lived in a world very different from ours, but its fossilized remains connect us to that world and help us understand the deep history of our own species. The summer I discovered paleontology changed everything about how I saw the world around me. It taught me that the familiar landscape of my childhood was actually an archive of deep time, preserving stories that stretched back millions of years. It showed me that science was not just abstract knowledge from textbooks, but a way of reading the world that could reveal extraordinary secrets hidden in ordinary places. Most importantly, it taught me that curiosity and careful observation could lead to discoveries that change our understanding of who we are and where we came from. The boy who helped uncover Ouranopithecus may have started with simple questions about dark objects in red clay, but those questions opened up a lifelong journey of exploration that connected a small Greek village to the greatest story ever told, the story of evolution and the deep history of life on Earth. Today, when I work with students beginning their own scientific careers, I try to pass on not just technical knowledge but also the sense of wonder and discovery that Professor de Bonis shared with me. I tell them about a summer when a village boy's curiosity about fossils led to discoveries that expanded human understanding of our evolutionary past, and how science can transform both our knowledge of the world and our own lives in ways we never imagined possible. The truth about Ouranopithecus is still being written as new fossils are discovered and new analytical techniques reveal additional details about these ancient apes. But the human truth of that discovery, the way it connected a curious boy to the vast sweep of evolutionary time and opened up possibilities he had never dreamed of, remains one of the most important lessons of my life. That summer taught me that we are all part of a story much larger and older than our individual lives, a story written in fossils and sediments and preserved in the patient archive of the earth itself. And sometimes, if we're curious enough and careful enough in our observations, we can help read new chapters in that ancient story and add our own small contributions to humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world.